Yeah. Yep.
Okay. I'm not sure where we got to, but I guess my focus has been on rainfall triggered landslides out in the kind of the natural environment, and not on the sorts of things that Luke just talked about in terms of their control on farms and properties. And we've got quite a lot to get through, and apologies if you can't hear. I am talking quite quickly, but let's rock on and see where we get to. Right. I just want to start with a bit of an overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few concepts and the differences between landslide susceptibility, landslide hazard, and landslide risk. Then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on how vegetation can mitigate landslide hazard and how effective it is in doing that, and then wrap up with some takeaways. However, I do want to start with this video from the Whanganui Taranaki region that got hit by Cyclone Fihi in February 2018. So I'm going to play now, and it could be a bit noisy. It's a helicopter fly through. Now, if you recall, a few weeks later than this, the Nelson region got hit by Cyclone Gita, though much of the damage was on the other side of the bay than this recent storm. So while watching this, take note of where on the slopes landslides initiate and how ineffective some of the riparian vegetation is for stopping landslide generated sediment getting into waterways. So I think we've probably seen about enough of that for the moment. Now, to further put this topic into context, this slide shows a couple of perspectives on landslides and our ability to prevent them or to keep paying, that's paying out of your wallet, for their impacts. Now, the key takeaway here is that we, that's you and me, as members of the public, landowners, house owners, etc., need to understand that all New Zealand is susceptible to landslides, but some places are more susceptible than others. They will all have different thresholds for failure and require different size triggers to cause that failure. So why do we get landslides? And I don't really have the time to get into the mechanics of this, but in essence, it generally boils down to three main things: geology, landscape steepness or landscape character, and rainfall. I'm not talking about earthquake-triggered landslides, rainfall triggered landslides. I think we all know that New Zealand is geologically diverse. It's largely hilly and mountainous and has weather that can and does trigger landslides somewhere in New Zealand every year. I guess it's also important to understand a bit of our history and remind ourselves why we see scenes like these in the photos on the slide. So in pre-European times, Aotearoa New Zealand was forested, and when settlers arrived, much of that forest was removed for settlements and for agriculture. What happened then was a period of prosperity as the country grew, but then a period of severe floods and mass erosion started, and people began to ask questions about the long-term sustainability of New Zealand's hill country that's pictured in the photos here. But some had also observed during these storm events, there was less erosion where there were trees and forests, prompting a call to put trees back into some of these landscapes. But as we shall see later, it's not just a simple case of putting trees into the landscape, because they're effective only up to a point. It's also important that when we talk about landslides, we really understand some key concepts. Now, the first of these is annual recurrence interval, or ARI, or return period, and annual exceedance probability, or AEP. Now, both of these terms are a measure of the rarity of a rainfall event, and they more or less express the same thing. A 1 in 100 year event is pretty much the same as a 1% AEP. What that 1% AEP means is that there is a 1% chance that an event of this size or characteristics will occur within a given year. Now here on the screen, we have a hypothetical situation for a landscape's response to different rainfall triggering thresholds. Obviously, many threshold conditions for failure are met in the landscape in the more rare or infrequent event, the return period of 1 in 100 years. But note that these are all based on probability, statistics. So it is conceivable that one could get, and one does, get 2 1 in 100 year events in the same year. Now these probabilities are also calculated based on what's happened in the past, the records of which are short, because we've only been around a couple of hundred years in New Zealand, and we haven't measured rainfall for that long. And they're also calculated for a specific locality. So a 1 in 100 year rainfall in one location is going to be different from another location. Now, NIWA, there's a link at the bottom, have a tool called HIRDS, High Intensity Rainfall Design System, that provides this information for all of New Zealand, and it's definitely worth a look if you want to know more. It's a clickable map. You can go there and you can get details of the sorts of recurrence interval events. Now, another thing to understand that it's not just about the total amount of rain that falls in an event, but it's also what happens within an event. So one might get a really intense burst of rainfall in 1 hour or 3 hours of the 36-hour duration event, and it is that bit of the rainfall that caused landslides to be triggered. So we look at the combination of intensity and duration characteristics of past events that have triggered landslides to construct a graph like we have on the slide, with duration in hours along the x-axis and intensity in millimeters per hour on the y-axis. Now, this kind of information helps us to understand the conditions in which landslides might occur, are likely to occur, or will always occur. Now, this figure was constructed from a database of over 1,000 landslide triggering rainfall events that occurred in New Zealand from 1875 to 2019 and covered data from all of New Zealand. Now, if we take a 10-hour duration storm, that's arrowed on the slide there, if we have rainfall intensities of more than about 4 millimeters per hour, landslides will likely occur because it puts us in that band above the bottom dotted line. But a 10-hour duration storm with intensities greater than 20 millimeters an hour is always going to trigger landslide. So this graph tells you about the kinds of rainfalls, amounts, intensity, and duration that are going to trigger landslides, but not that probability, which is what the HIRDS tool I mentioned in the previous slide does provide. I now want us to stand back and let us consider the hill slope and landscape scale over a long period of time. So if we consider a slope, then at any point on that slope, the balance between the soil's shear strength, which is how strong it is, and the shear stress, which is the forces, gravity, wanting to try and push it off the slope, is continually changing. And that's that thin, wiggly black line on the graph. And the balance between shear strength and stress is termed the factor of safety. And geotechnical engineers like Luke, they do these sorts of calculations quite frequently. But what this graph illustrates, that failure can occur due to a number of conditions, such as triggered by an intense storm rainfall at position 1, as we see here, or in very wet conditions following a very wet winter or prolonged rainfall of low intensity, such as at position 2, or where the strength of the soil is gradually reduced over a long period of time through a process termed ripening, such as at position 3. And at this point, the soil or the slope can fail without any apparent trigger. And I guess the simplest way to think about it is think of it as the natural death of a long-lived piece of hill slope. So what we need to understand is that across the landscape, parts of slopes are getting ready to fail, are continually failing, and are renewing all the time. So all across that landscape, there are places with different thresholds that require different magnitude triggers to make them fail. Okay, so now we've understood rainfall and the concept of geomorphic thresholds. It's time to look at three other concepts and the differences between them, because this is also a source of confusion, particularly with the public. So those three terms, susceptibility, hazard, and risk, are different, and many people use them interchangeably and incorrectly. So landslide susceptibility is the likelihood of a landslide occurring in an area on the basis of local terrain conditions, such as its geology, slope, aspect, soil thickness, and a bunch of other things. Landslide hazard is when this has the potential to cause harm, injury or damage to property or the environment, and landslide risk is a combination of two things: the chance or probability that the hazard will actually happen and how serious that harm could be. In other words, the consequence. For example, having high landslide susceptibility really becomes important if the recurrence probability is high and the consequence, should the hazard be realized, is also high. In other words, we can have a high hazard, but if there's little consequence, if it happens, the risk is actually low. Now, as part of our research, we develop what are termed statistically based modelling approaches to address how susceptible our landscapes are to these rainfall triggered landslides. And what we do is we combine a range of terrain attributes like slope, aspect, geology, vegetation cover, rainfall, and so on, until we get a model. It's a statistical model that produces the best predictive value. We then use that model to construct regional maps of landslide susceptibility, as we can see here, for two regions, one in the Manawatu, Wanganui area, and the other in the Hawke's Bay. Now, this kind of information can be used to inform catchment management and where to focus attention to deliver freshwater management targets. However, these maps do not tell us where a landslide will occur or when it will occur. Further, it's important to understand that a landslide susceptibility map does not generally work across multiple scales. So those regional and catchment scale maps don't work very well at a farm or property scale, and one that's developed at a farm scale won't work very well at a regional scale. But the advent of high resolution satellite imagery and LiDAR has really improved the performance of many such models in recent years, and I think science will make a bit of advance in this general area in future years. So all of these preceding points lead us to the question, can we predict landslides? And the simple answer is not really, but sort of. Our science is not yet advanced enough and may never be able to predict exactly where in the landscape a rainfall triggered failure will occur, under exactly what conditions, and when it's going to occur. The exception being perhaps some of the localities that Luke mentioned, and I heard it in the earlier part of the talk, particularly around places that are fairly obvious that either a failure has occurred in the past or where fill or something has been placed in a vulnerable position on a slope. So our science can only broadly indicate areas that are more susceptible or likely to fail in a relative sense, as I showed on those previous slides. Whipping through here now. So turning now to erosion and landslides, and can these be mitigated using vegetation? Well, plants have been used in a geotechnical engineering context for millennia, and there are documented accounts of their use in places like China and Europe. And modern soil bioengineering has had a renaissance in recent years as people and agencies look to more environmentally friendly, nature-based solutions to many of our environmental problems. In many of these situations, plants tend to complement other traditional engineering practices, and both have their places. And just to round this out, here are a few pictures of some past and present bioengineering practices in New Zealand, though they were called soil conservation and river control, and mostly used exotic plants like poplars and willows, and I believe you're going to be talking about poplars and how to plant them in the next talk. And we can probably include reforestation, which is largely done with exotic conifers for erosion control in this as well. So how do trees and forests work to prevent shallow landslides? Well, they do this through two mechanisms. Their roots reinforce the soil, much the same as you put steel and concrete to provide that reinforcement. And secondly, their canopy intercepts and evaporates rainfall and uses soil water. And what this does is it results in forest soils remaining drier for longer under grass on similar land under the same rainfall. Dry soils are stronger than wet soils, and adding those roots further enhances that soil strength. However, as you might expect, the depth of reinforcement is limited by how deep those roots go, and this is usually only in the order of a metre or so, and that's basically why trees are really useful in preventing shallow landslides on our hill country, where most soils are actually quite shallow. Now here on this graph, we have landslide triggering thresholds on the y-axis and time, on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. When we plant trees on slopes that don't have trees on them, such as on a pastoral hill country, what we do is we shift the threshold for failure upwards. In other words, we've increased that soil strength. However, when we harvest or remove those trees, the opposite happens. And the hydrological conditions are changed because there's no canopy to intercept that rainfall, and the soils become wetter and stay wetter for longer, and wetter soils aren't as strong as dry soils. Secondly, those roots that reinforcing start to decay and lose their reinforcing effect. And then what happens is the threshold for failure shifts down, and we now have many points on that slope that would have failed, but for the presence of trees, but didn't, that are fundamentally ready to go the next time it rains or when the soil wets up. And what that phenomenon explains is that we can and we do get failures on harvested forests in the first few years following harvesting that don't relate at all to a big storm. They are just places that would have failed in that last 30 years, or they are places where their time was up. However, if we do get a big storm, we can, just like in the grass situation, realize many of those thresholds all at once, giving rise to scenes such as we see at the bottom of the slide. To explain this a little bit more, here we have some data from Cyclone Bowler that occurred on the East Coast in 1988. The top graph shows the average landslide density, that's a number per unit area, declining with different vegetation covers. And the bottom graph, decreasing soil loss with increasing age of exotic plantations. In other words, soil loss declines as the trees get older and reach canopy closure. The message here is that in a given storm, grass-covered slopes and young plantations will tend to have more landslides and lose more soil than older, well-established exotic and native forests. So a couple of years ago, we reviewed what we knew about erosion and sediment control effectiveness and performance in New Zealand, and that's the report that Annette's mentioned just a minute ago. And in that report, we define effectiveness as the extent to which the soil conservation treatment or practice achieves the desired outcome. In other words, does it work? But the actual performance is the actual measure of sediment reduction the device or intervention results in, and it's usually expressed as a percentage relative to a control. And while there is some generic information and you think that we'd have all the science, we actually do not have a lot of really good data. So we're not overwhelmed with good data occurring across different parts of New Zealand. But the typical performance values are really highly variable, and many of the interventions that are used, even in the kind of construction industry, only ever reduce sediment loss by about a half. And for those erosion and sediment control practices that involve trees and shrubs, it can take quite a bit of time, up to 10 years or more, before they're deemed to be effective. Now, in terms of mitigating erosion or providing soil reinforcement, what do we actually want from our vegetation? Now, I've listed some things on the slide there. Obviously, we want ease of establishment, and the poplar pole, as you'll find out in a moment, is actually pretty easy to establish. So establishment isn't just how easy they are to bung in the ground. Establishment's all about, will they survive that first 5 years? And there is no such thing as a perfect plant. They all have their good points and bad points, and much of it depends on your viewpoint. In terms of erosion control, though, it's as much about how many you plant, in other words, the density of them, as it is about the actual species. Now, over the years, we've looked at a range of species root systems with some examples shown on the slide here. Native plants in green, exotic in light orange. Now, some of these have been assessed as individual trees growing in natural or planted stands, while others have been assessed in experimental field trials, including both one-off and replicated trials. Now, there is information on many of these native plants, and I suggest that you follow that link or Google ICM Motueka website for posters on the roots of native plants. Now, surprisingly to some people, the root systems of trees actually do look different between species in much the same way as their above ground morphologies do. So here in the slide, Cupressus lusitanica or cypress can be characterized as having high root density and high symmetry with fine feathery roots, while Tasmanian blackwood has low root density and spidery roots with a moderate degree of root symmetry in much the same way as a poplar has. So that's very quick, and I'm running slow. I've got 2 more slides. Now, a bit of a diversion, but something I'd like you to ponder on. Here we have similar situations in terms of landscape response between grass slopes on the left and recently harvested plantation slopes on the right, and the likely contribution of sediment in a big storm to the coast from both land uses is likely to be pretty similar. But the way in which society or the public sees these two situations often tends to be really different. And I guess this leads us to questions around what can and what can't actually be managed, about questions around the forest industry's social license to operate, and particularly around the public's perceptions and understanding of natural hazards and their management. We don't have the time to explore these questions now, but I do want you to ponder further on this paradox as you consider what you do in the future on your land, and in particular, your own understanding of what you think can and what actually can't be managed. So to wrap up, just some takeaways. All New Zealand is susceptible to landslides, some places are more so than others. These concepts, susceptibility, hazard and risk, are not the same, and we need to get clear on using the right term in the right place. Our science isn't sophisticated enough to predict where a landslide will occur, nor can we predict when it occurs, and we may never ever get there. But we can indicate where in the landscape conditions are such that a landslide might occur, and we can establish the likelihood that one might occur in future based on what's happened in the past. We've got to get our planning right. We need better mapping, we need better zoning. We need to understand that we don't put infrastructure in hazardous areas. In some cases, we may need to get away from or retreat from these hazardous areas. I think we need to be prepared and be insured. And I put while you can, because I believe you'll get to a stage in New Zealand where there'll be some places we will not be able to insure at all. Engineering can't solve everything. Vegetation can't solve everything. So we need to improve our understanding of our natural hazard. But vegetation is a key tool in the toolbox for mitigating landslides, but it is not the solution everywhere, and it is effective only up to a point. Targeting vegetation to those most susceptible places is far more effective than just randomly putting trees all over the place. Natives have a place, and if you want to end up with natives, don't throw the idea having a native exotic mix as a transitional pathway to the endpoint that you want to get to. I see too many cases of people planting natives, which is basically standing on the hillside throwing $20 bills into the breeze because they haven't thought well about the situation they're trying to plant in. And we can try to manage our landscapes, but nature is always going to win. So that's me. Thanks for listening. And if you want to follow up on things, I know it's going to be really hard to do question and answers. Annette has my contact details, so thank you. And apologies for going over time.
Does anybody have a question? I can convey it to Chris and he'll hear me. Anybody have a question from that? So what are the best plants for erosion control, Chris, in your opinion?
As a scientist, one would say it depends. It depends on what you're trying to control. Erosion there's different types of erosion processes. There's surface erosion, gully erosion, earth flow erosion, landslide erosion, or shallow landslide erosion.
Okay, just for gully erosion.
Paired plantings of willows, non-invasive, non-spreading willows that you can obtain. They tend to shore up depending on how big the gully is, if it's not humongous, they will work and basically stop the down cutting of the stream and shore up the contributing slope. So them or paired poplars, if you don't want to use willows, but they're proven to work in many situations in New Zealand hill country. There are other plants for other situations, but if it's just a gully, that's what I go with.